was dope.
All right, welcome back to Rufus Villain. I'm here with fucking Chad. What's up, brother?
What's up?
Yeah, so tonight we're gonna like nerd out on plants, and I think that's something I've been pushing you to do for a long time.
Yeah, it's something I kind of never stopped doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like my
can
first
get-
question is, why do you love plants? Why do you love that organism, that thing? You know, I know you can do this, man. I know,
Yeah.
and I've got more than to say that. Yeah, go ahead. I'll shut up and go ahead.
All right. Yeah, plants. Plants, fungi, all kinds of nature, bacteria, all that stuff is really interesting, and they all kind of play a role in the existence that we experience and live in. So plants are really important.
Well, it's like since I've known you, it was something something that's always played a role in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, plants are interesting. They're interesting to observe. They have a wide range of adaptability, and it's kind of like watching magic happen.
I like that.
Definitely, it's a personification of magic. You have a dried up rock-looking seed, and you add water, and
It becomes
in
life.
a few days it springs to a green organism, and then it has a root system that seeks out nutrients and moisture and knows what to do from gravity and from its own nature of seeking things out. And then the green parts shoot up towards the sunlight to do their job, and it's all kind of either mathematical or magically ordained. It's a code that's in each individual seed.
I like that phrase. It's code.
Well, it is. It's a genetic code.
Yeah.
And every living thing has it.
Is it fair to say that I might have the word wrong, but like plants of the absorbing what do you call it when they absorb light?
Photosynthesis.
Is that fair to say that's like the first life form on Earth?
No.
Okay.
No, definitely not. But it's a really interesting mechanism, and it's the photosynthesis part of plants of obtaining energy. Liquid or moisture is also required, but the photosynthesis kind of takes these UV rays and filters them in a way and utilizes it for energy, like solar cells, and uses that to pump nutrients from its root system throughout its leaves, which will also cool the leaves from the UV that it's absorbing. And it's, again, a really well calculated. If you're looking at it from a mathematical perspective, plants have an amazing ability of adaptation to their environments.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But it's also kind of magic in a way, because it's through a series of circumstances that these plants have adapted in these particular ways, and it's not like somebody sitting behind a computer saying,
right.
well, this is the mathematical sequence for a mesquite tree to have pinnate leaves, and this is different.
Explain what that leaf means. Like, explain. What did you say? Did you say
pinnate leaf?
Yeah.
It's like a segmented leaf.
Is that what
shape.
what a mesquite would have?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's lots of little leaves on kind of like
One
a stem, but it's still considered, that one stem offshoot is considered one leaf. So it's all kind of like fingers that
That's
open and
interesting.
close to allow various amounts of light or perspiration, moisture coming off the leaves to keep themselves alive when it's really hot.
So one of the big things I wanted to bring up is, like, Chad and I live in what would you call it? The
Sonoran Desert.
Sonoran Desert. And a lot of plants here are very unique. We have a lot of cactus. We have one in particular, my favorite plant of all time, which I've talked to you about, is the creosote.
Mm-hmm.
And the way it survives is really interesting, because like that thing could get watered like once a year.
Well, it needs a little bit more water than that, but it can get by on literally droplets of water rather than gallons of water. So
Mhm.
it can get by on very little water. Has very small leaves, and they're coated with oils that are protective against all kinds
That's
of
where you get that
different.
smell from, right?
Yeah, that's what gives the Sonoran Desert and a lot of desert regions in the United States a very distinct smell when it rains.
Yeah.
The oils on the creosote tree, which the botanical name is Laria tridentata.
Fuck y'all, look that shit up.
Yeah, it's it's called greasewood. It's called creosote, chaparral. It has a lot of different names, but it's the same plant,
Mm.
and it's in
So
pretty
does-
much all the deserts.
So
here.
does that oil like serve as like maybe like an insecticide or?
Yes, definitely, and also for mammals that are like deer and things like that might want to come along and eat the leaves of something in the desert. It has kind of a bitter taste to it.
Yeah.
It's not very much
not
prey.
appetizing.
It's not very much preyed on by any herbivores in the area, because it does have a very strong oil. But its fragrance is really pleasant, and people do use it for medicine and for kind of aromatherapy too.
What would be a medicinal application for that?
Well, it's antibacterial, antimicrobial, antifungal.
That's
It
not-
has a huge range of topical applications and potentially some internal applications for kind of common cold symptoms and things
Really?
like that. Yeah.
So my next question is like, so here in the Sonoran Desert, what would be some of the top like medicinal plants?
Oh man.
Yeah.
That's a question I could
Well,
I could run with for hours.
that's why I ask.
So creosote is one of them for any kind of skin rash or infection.
I didn't know that.
Type of thing.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like I said, antimicrobial, antifungal. So if you got athlete's foot, something like that, that helps. It's it's got a lot of different applications. Again, some people take it internally for common cold symptoms and
Wow.
kind of antibacterial qualities. But you have to be careful not to take too much of it, because if you get a lot of that oil internally, it'd probably make you sick to your stomach. Too much of it would probably be an
Like the
irritant.
oil on the leaf.
Yeah. Like if you drank a bunch of creosote tea, it'd probably make you sick. But
I've never
just a
had
little
creosote.
bit mixed with some other things like mint or something would probably be okay.
Yeah.
But that's one primary one. The aloe vera plant grows abundantly out here.
If you guys know anything about the Sonoran Desert and sunburns,
Well, and many of the aloe vera that is here is not a native plant. It actually comes from Africa.
I do not know.
But it
What?
is very prevalent out here. So it's a really good medicinal. But there's also native cacti that have a similar thing. People have used prickly pear
Okay.
in a similar way to aloe vera for sunburns and things like that.
Wow, really?
Yeah, but you gotta be careful with that one too, because some of them can be a little bit caustic. So they actually use prickly pear to create lime plaster.
Oh shit!
The mucilage.
Yeah.
There's a chemical.
So
process
so
that
like
happens.
the mucus type stuff is what you would apply to your skin.
Yes,
right.
yes.
So what?
The inner pads, especially younger pads, would be good.
Oh, okay. So those are the more edible ones, right?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So like what pops in my mind is like, okay, so you look at like, if you guys know what prickly pear is, it's your quote unquote paddle cactus.
Opuntia.
So we particularly in this area have like really spiny ones
Yes.
and some that don't have any spines.
Well, the ones that don't have any spines, the ones that you have seen, that's mostly Opuntia ficus indica, and that actually comes from Europe.
Okay.
So indica indicates India as a place of origin.
Oh, okay.
So and ficus is like a tree. So it's the tree prickly pear of India. Is how I would interpret the Latin name.
I couldn't imagine like prickly pear or cactus being in India.
Prickly pear is in every continent except for Antarctica.
Really?
So, yeah, it's the most widespread plant in the world, I would say, as far as like, it's not necessarily the most prevalent, but it's very widespread. You find them at high elevations. So, even where there's snow and ice, you'll sometimes find prickly pear varieties, opuntiads. But they are on every continent except for Antarctica. I don't think there's ever been prickly pear found.
Correct me here, but is a prickly pear a succulent?
It's a cacti.
Okay,
Yeah, cacti, cactus. So succulents are a little bit different, but they're very closely akin to cacti. Cacti typically have some sort of spines or glochids, which are those really fine hairs.
Yeah, which you get in your fingers.
And you can't
sucks.
You can't see them, and they're a pain.
I had a girlfriend a long time ago, and Chad was here, and she decided to pet a cactus. Do you remember that?
I do not, but
yes,
I don't doubt it.
Yeah, she did. It was fuzzy, and she's like, "Oh my god, my fingers!"
Oh,
but
yeah. So a quick remedy for that: if you ever get a bunch of little glochids,
if you ever pet a cactus,
if you ever decide to pet a cactus that looks fuzzy and soft, don't do it. First of all, second of all, take some Elmer's glue and just smear it all over your fingers and pretend you're in first grade and
just let
it dry and peel it off. And not all of them, especially if you pet a cactus, but most of them will come loose with the glue when you peel it from your fingers.
Okay.
The other alternative is you can kind of take some duct tape, something with a really good strong bond, and kind of go back and forth over your fingers, but that's going to drive them in a little bit more too. So Elmer's glue works pretty good. And don't pet a cactus.
Don't pet a cactus. So if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. The saguaro is completely native to where we're at, right?
Well, it's not just completely native; it's completely exclusive to where we live. So the saguaro cactus only exists in the Sonoran Desert.
And Chad and myself have grown up around them. We see them every day.
Yeah. We're pretty much smack in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, the territory of the saguaro cactus. It goes a little bit farther north, maybe 100 miles, if that, north, and maybe about 100 miles south of where we are, and a little bit east and west. But once you get into Nevada or even close to Nevada, you stop seeing saguaro cactus.
That's amazing. Is it because of the climate?
It's the climate. It's so it's the weather patterns, the unique weather patterns that we have, and the unique soil. It's a combination of both of those. Daylight, all of those things. And so a saguaro cactus might grow, in another place, but it's not going to thrive and it won't reproduce.
Okay.
So there's, people that have shipped saguaro cactus or people growing them from seed in other places.
And they just don't...
Well, they'll get to be, like if you grow one from seed, say in Michigan, even if you're protecting it from the cold when it freezes and all of that stuff, you'll get it to maybe 3 or 4 feet tall, and then it'll probably, get sick and die.
Peter out. And like your average, like you guys have no idea all over the world listening to us, like the height of real saguaro cactus. They can get to like 20 feet tall, right?
Well, I liken the saguaro cactus to the desert equivalent of the redwood forest.
Exactly.
So, it's each saguaro cactus is hundreds of years old. Usually, if it's of any size, it's hundreds of years old.
They start to sprout arms and all
that. So around between 50 and 100 years old, they usually sprout their first arms, and sometimes they'll sprout multiple arms within the same decade.
And it's a beautiful thing to see, like if you understand what they are. It's pretty amazing. 'Cause, like we're spoiled. We see those all over town.
Yeah, they're very common sight around Tucson and the
Sonoras.
Sonoran. Well, it's the Sonoran Desert, so it's kind of the lower part of Arizona, midern. It's not really so much eastern Arizona. I would say it kind of happens around Tucson, and then goes up towards Phoenix, but not too much farther beyond Phoenix, and then it goes south into Mexico. The Sonoran Desert is definitely part of Mexico.
So am I wrong with the Sonoran Desert? Technically, is close to the. It's like one of the larger deserts in the world as far as like its topography.
Well, that I don't know. I don't know that fact as far as its designated range and how it relates to other deserts.
It's supposed to be pretty big.
I mean, it's a big region. So like a majority of the Sonoran Desert is actually in Mexico.
Yeah.
So like ecologically, if we kind of erase all the lines of politics and what country and state is what, we have more in common 300 miles south than we have in common 100 miles north.
That's an amazing concept. That's an amazing concept. Not to like derail, but I had a really cool question. Is there a lot of cacti that are specific to us, specific to this area?
There's a good amount, but saguaro is one of them.
Well, like maybe like organ pipe or.
Well, organ pipe isn't exclusive to us. Actually, we're on the outskirts of the organ pipe region. Just like another region would be on the outskirts of the saguaro region.
Okay.
So we do have organ pipe here, but it's not.
It's not exclusive.
It's not exclusive, and it's not the prevalent cacti around here. I'd say saguaro is much more common, and the barrel cactus and things like that. Which there's other varieties of barrel cactus, but
is it false to say that barrel cactus leans south?
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
They call it the compass cactus for that reason, because it leans.
They'll uproot themselves doing that.
Well, yeah, if they in the wild, if they're growing for 50 years, they get to be about 5 feet tall, and they mostly grow up, but because they're leaning towards the south, because in the winter the sun is lower on the horizon. Okay. They lean to the south once they get a certain mass, and depending on what the soil is that they're rooted in, sometimes they'll tip over just by their own body weight and inertia, just kind of slowly pulling them out of the soil. But if they're anchored up against a large rock or a boulder, on a cliffside, they'll hang there forever.
Yeah.
But if it's just kind of like clay soil, and then we have a big monsoon rain and it washes some of the soil away, then it's more prone to falling over.
To lose its like anchor.
Mm-hmm.
This might be out of nowhere, but I kind of had a thought while you were talking about that. The barrel cactus has like these hooks.
Yeah.
And then you think of a saguaro. Mm-hmm. Is that like a specific genus that like makes a sharp point or a hook?
Well, so you're talking about one particular type of barrel cactus? Well, I mean, there's a couple of them.
I'm talking about cactus in general.
Right.
So where they create like. Well,
so not all barrel cactus have that hook to their thorns.
Well, let me throw this in real quick. So what pops into my mind is like what's in my brain is like all these like think about cholla.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have you guys out there in other parts of the country, you might not be familiar with the cholla, but
which if you're typing it in, it's spelled cholla, CHOLLA.
Or they could even call it like a jumping cactus.
Well, that's one type of cholla. The cholla cactus, again, if you're typing it phonetically, it's cholla, CHOLLA. There's a bunch of different varieties. The botanical name is Cylindropuntia. So remember, prickly pear is Opuntia.
Okay.
A while back, because names change in science books, a while back, cholla cactus was considered an Opuntia, but they were recently designated as a Cylindropuntia, basically a cylindrical prickly pear. It's instead of fanning out like a pad, it's in a cylinder. So that's how the cactus pad forms, is in a cylinder.
Yeah.
So then the jumping cactus.
Yeah, I was gonna say, give him an idea of what a jumping cactus is.
The,
I got that shit in
well,
my
and
toes.
that's kind of a legendary cactus in the Southwest. The jumping cactus is it's also known as the teddy bear cholla. It's got a lot of thick, almost white with thorns. It's mostly spines, and a segment of it will dislodge from the plant
Just by touching you.
Yeah, the spines will stick in you, and you'll jerk back and pull a whole segment of the plant, and then you'll probably shake your hand in disbelief and fling it on some other poor unsuspecting person, and the trauma continues.
I like that the trauma continues.
So that's a thing, but. That's one particular type of cholla. There's a bunch of different ones, and a lot of them are actually used as food.
Mm-hmm.
The Cylindropuntia versicolor, that's a staghorn cholla. It doesn't have as many spines. It's still pretty fucking spiny. You don't want to like brush up against it. But the flower buds, the pre-fruit with a flower that hasn't opened yet, is usually harvested in spring as a vegetable, and it actually has more calcium in one of those little fruits than a 8-ounce glass of milk.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And we have such a in the Sonoran Desert, we have a pretty impressive variety of cacti.
Yeah.
We've got
probably thousands.
Yeah, like the way I kind of think of it is like our forest is way different.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, is you do have to kind of think of it as a forest. It is that. It doesn't look like a jungle. It doesn't look like the redwood forest. You are much, much more exposed to the sun.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of shade out there. I have two references of shade. There's sky shade and ground shade.
Mm-hmm.
Sky shade is clouds.
Like
ground shade is what's created by the minuscule little plants that live out here, which there's not many of them that get more than 10 feet tall to provide you any shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking for shade in the desert, a lot of times you got to find some ground shade.
Especially here in the Sonoran Desert, we don't have like we have mesquites and stuff like that.
Yeah, and in certain areas they can get quite large. And there definitely are areas that you find more shade than others, but there's many stretches of the desert that again, we were talking about pinnate leaves. Their whole thing is to close up and make themselves as small as possible during the heat of the day, so they don't lose as much moisture through their leaves, and they're keeping themselves cool. But they don't provide a lot of shade because they're trying not to take on all those UV rays, just like you're trying not to. Yeah. So they don't create a lot of shade.
So, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying.
I'm sorry, but what pops into my mind now is, like, this is so off of like that liner notes I put together for tonight. But the insects of where we live and the benefits to the plants that we live around, and I freak out when I see bees because I'm all super allergic, and it just kind of blows my mind to, like you were talking about, like just the sun-baked, where we are is sun-baked.
Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that we deal with a lot of like subterranean insects, but we do have a lot, like we have bees, we have wasps, we have dragonflies, whatever. But I think the majority of what we would have that would transport pollen would probably be underground. To be
somewhat, yeah. I mean, not as much for pollen, but so our native bees, many of them are actually what you would consider subterranean. They're digger bees, leafcutter bees, things like that. That kind of they're considered solitary bees. They don't live in a hive situation.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Most bees don't in the world. It's really the honeybee is the only one that lives in that like hive scenario, originally from Europe and then later from Africa, and we have a bunch of feral honeybees, but none of them are native.
Okay.
Honeybees are not native to the United States.
Well, that makes sense.
But there are thousands and thousands of other bees out there that live solitarily. And many of them live in the ground and kind of nest in rocks and nooks and crannies, or sometimes in trees and plants. They'll nest themselves. That's the
Our,
native bees that we have here are that they nest in the ground. And you usually find those things around small places of moisture. They're going to seek out wherever the closest water source is.
Okay.
So they're not going to go too far from that. And there is moisture in the desert. It's just
Needs to be found.
it's you got to seek it out, and it's in certain arroyos and certain little nooks and crannies.
Can you tell the people that aren't in Arizona what an arroyo is?
Arroyo is like a creek, or it's not really a creek because it's not flowing all the time. Underground, there's water flowing, probably. There's moisture. But when we have rains, it's a place where it flows, and moisture usually gathers in pockets and things like that. So sweat bees and little insects will exist there longer than they would in the dry desert areas. But sometimes those places also dry up, and they also don't exist there anymore. So that's nature.
Well, I was going to ask you about the pollinating or the pollinating potential of ants.
Yeah. So they pollinate specific types of things.
They also cultivate their own fungus and stuff, right?
Yeah, well, different ants do different things. There's a lot of different types of ants, but so there are some little ants that are actually really helpful in the garden. They pollinate things like squash and cucumbers and viney plants. They use them as like little highways, and
I've seen that in our own gardens in the yard.
Yeah, they use it as a little highway, and the flower gives them a little bit of sweet nectar, which is what they're after. And so they go from one flower to another flower to collect this nectar, and they get some pollen on them, and so they share the pollen. So they're kind of doing what bees do, but walking instead of flying, and in great numbers. So that's one kind of bee, or one kind of ant. And then there's what you were talking about, the harvester ants that farm their own fungus. They will strip your plants almost overnight in some cases.
I've had so many of my tomato plants just
right. So in nature, and especially in the desert during certain times of year, there's a lot of leaf drop, both in spring for some plants and in fall for other plants. They drop a lot of debris, either leaves or flowers, and these ants in the natural environment, in the wild desert, they go and collect all of this deadfall that's on the ground and take it underground, and they inoculate it with some fungus.
Spit too, right?
Well, yeah, they make little colonies of this fungus. They're literally cultivating it, and then that is their food. So they actually are trying to eat the fungus, but they know they have to harvest this organic material, this substrate.
So they're farmers.
They're not just farmers, but they're like gatherers.
Yeah.
So because they go out and if they don't find deadfall, they find a living plant and actually cut pieces out of the leaves and carry them down.
I've had plants stripped overnight.
Yeah. So they're very meticulous, because they're like, okay, here's the plan, guys. We found some leaves. There's some material. We need to expand our farms.
Yeah.
We're going to send a crew out there to harvest the material we need to grow our food. Okay, everybody go. And then overnight, and then overnight they strip your plants. They bring it subterranean. They let it dry out. They inoculate it with a fungus, and they cultivate that and eat it and multiply.
It's just amazing, the communication. The communication of
it's
they all have their own jobs.
Well, it's not very complex, actually. It's a really simple means of communication. And it's a lot of pheromones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the thing is they're just geared really crudely as far as living organisms go, or as far as what we think of as animals. But they are amazing in their tenacity, strength, and resilience.
Yeah.
And their great numbers, their effectiveness.
Isn't there more insects on the planet than there is humans?
I would say so, absolutely. I mean, insects is a huge kingdom.
Yeah.
That's like, it's like saying plants or animals. It's like a big range.
So like the next thing that I want to hop on to is like, so here in the Sonoran Desert, when is the best time of year to plant specific things? To like, what time? What would you call it? Winter right now?
Yeah, it's still winter. It's
Yeah.
it's January, so it's pretty much right in the middle of winter, in the Sonoran Desert, and it's
We're averaging from like 30 to
it hasn't been 30
at
degrees.
night. At night.
No, it's been like maybe 36 these past couple weeks, but it's cold, but it's not frosty, or it's just barely frosty.
Yeah.
So when we hit
our winter days here are like 70 degrees.
yeah, you can pretty much grow things year round here, but this time of year, lettuce does well, cilantro or coriander, leafy greens, kale, broccoli, cabbage, all of those things do well.
Do any of those require anything like specific in their soil or anything?
Well, they all really need good gardening soil. So our native soil isn't really conducive to growing most of those things, and they will grow. Like I have some volunteer lettuce kind of popping up wild in the yard because we've had actually decent rains this year, but it's not a good nutritive soil for like leafy greens. They typically want more nitrogen in the soil, or more organic material than is normal for our desert soils here. But and you can get some pretty basic garden soil or potting soil,
supplement it basically.
Yeah, or add manure or some kind of fertilizer. And you can create some good soil for those things. But coming in about a month, say mid-February, end of February, it's basically spring. So you can plant corn, beans, squash, cucumbers,
you gotta think ahead.
Peppers. Well, tomatoes and peppers, actually, you should start the seeds now, but you have to kind of watch the...
well, that's what I mean by like
the weather.
Ahead.
Yeah, you got to bring them inside when it's going to be in the 30s and... kind of baby them along for the first month or so until either the weather warms up or they get a little bit bigger and a little more resilient. They can handle cooler temperatures. But I usually start my peppers and stuff anywhere between January 1st and February 1st.
Okay.
So anytime in the month of January is a good time. And then you should be able to get some spring production. The reason why you want to start them so early is when it gets really hot, like in late June, you want to be able to give them enough time to produce before that, because they basically stop producing.
Right.
Peppers will continue to produce usually, but tomatoes, when it's 112 degrees, they're just trying to stay alive.
Yeah.
So they're not going to be very productive. And also the tomatoes on the tomato vines, if they're larger tomatoes, they're more prone to splitting because they're using up and absorbing water too rapidly, and it causes their skin to split.
Well, you showed me one time where if you don't water them consistently and then you water them a bunch, they'll split.
Yeah. The key with tomatoes is a consistent water supply. So if they dry out and look really wilty, and don't give them a big soak. If there's tomatoes on there, if there's not any tomato setting, give it a drink. But if there's a big, almost ripe red tomato and it's looking good, don't give it a bunch of water right away. Give it a slow drip. Because if you give it too much water, the tomato will absorb the water so quickly that it splits the skin of the tomato.
So are tomatoes and peppers like really the only thing that we could grow down here to eat?
No.
That's my question. Because what I was going to say is like, what could we here in the Sonoran Desert grow for food? Like on on a basis to where it could be, say, I'll get to this question later about survival, but like if we had to grow our own food, what would work the best here?
Well, so, looking forward to that question on survival, it kind of depends on the water supply. So right now, with a municipal water supply, we get water delivered from the Colorado River. We can grow pretty much whatever we want. I've got a buddy that's growing bananas, mangoes,
That's insane.
papayas. His yard is like a tropical orchard.
Is this Jake?
Yes.
Shout out to Jake.
So you can grow whatever you want as long as you have a water supply. If you don't have that water supply and you're relying on rain, or even just half of your water supply being rain, your options are much, much more limited.
I could imagine, yeah.
There's still options. There's still things that'll grow out here with very little rain during certain times of year. Or taking advantage of our monsoon season, which is in July through early August.
Again, I hate to say this, but for the listeners, we have people listening all over. Explain what a monsoon is.
Well, so a monsoon is a seasonal weather pattern where a region receives basically a majority of its yearly rainfall. So Australia has monsoons. India has monsoons. It's a seasonal kind of weather pattern.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a seasonal weather pattern that comes through in the warmer months. And it drops a majority of our yearly rainfall in a very short period of time. So most of the year, the desert is very dry. This period between early July and August, into September usually, is when we get most of our rain. So it's the traditional planting time for this area. If we're looking back through history with native people.
That was actually one of my follow-up question is native cultivation.
Yeah, so native peoples, they also made use of what nature provided and provides here in the desert. So a lot of the food was wild harvested, not necessarily cultivated. So like I was saying about the cholla cactus, the little buds are edible. That was a staple food. The mesquite tree, which is
you can make flour, right?
Yeah, it's a protein-rich flour. It's a legume. So it's got a sweetness to it. It's got some carbohydrates, and basically make a flour out of the mesquite beans. The prickly pear, both the pads and the fruit. The barrel cactus, the fruit and the seeds. There's a lot of wild foods that were a staple part of the diet. The saguaro, which actually indicates the beginning of the monsoons.
Well, it's when the flowers, right?
Well, when the fruit is harvested.
Okay.
So again, this is going back to native Tohono O'odham culture, which is the indigenous group in our valley here in Tucson. Their planting ceremonies are usually preceded by a saguaro fruit harvest and ceremony associated with that harvest. And then people go out and plant their fields after that. And so part of that process is a fermentation of a saguaro wine, more or less, and that takes a period of several days. So kind of naturally timing out the weather patterns, because plants respond to whatever the weather is that year, not necessarily the calendar. So sometimes it blooms early, sometimes it blooms later. But whenever the fruit is ready, about 7 to 10 days after that, they have the ceremony, and then they go and plant. Because within 7 to 10 days after they plant, the first monsoon rain usually comes. So kind of historically passed down through tradition, they had this attunement with the plant world, kind of taking in this harvest and knowing that this harvest meant it was almost time to plant their cultivated seeds. And knowing that culminated with the weather patterns, because the saguaros respond to the weather, not the calendar.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
that's super, super amazing. Like you've talked to me about that before. I've lived with you a long time, and like I actually have like an understanding of what you're talking about, because we've been friends for 2 decades.
Yeah,
and it just kind of blows my mind to like what you said, that they didn't rely, like the native indigenous culture didn't rely on like an actual like calendar. It was the plants that
Yeah,
told
well, it was a lot of different environmental things that they were taking note of, and the months were given names that reflect kind of what was happening. Like, I'm not going to try to speak Tohono and butcher my pronunciations.
butcher the language.
But there's the yellow month, so that's in spring when all the trees that have yellow flowers are in bloom. So like the Palo Verde trees, and the desert looks like it's laced with gold because all of these yellow flowers are going on. So their name for that time of year is the yellow month.
That's awesome.
So there's different names like that. Going back to the saguaro harvest and the traditional time to planting, so the things that would be planted would be tepary beans, which is a local bean that's very protein dense and adapted to arid environments. They would plant some varieties of corn. That was a crop that would go in July with the monsoon rains, because pretty much the rest of the year you couldn't grow corn. It's just too dry.
That makes sense.
So corn would go in July. And there's some specific adapted corns that are fast to mature. They're like 60 days to maybe 80 days rather than 100 to 120.
Wow.
So they're
wow,
really
I
fast.
didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. So what's the difference between like a meal corn and a flour corn?
Well, those are pretty close to each other. So, there's a lot of different types of corn. So there's
I opened a can.
There's popcorn. There's flint corn, dent corn, flour corn, sweet corn, and teosinte. So teosinte is the ancestor of all of them. They're the
Isn't it really small?
Yeah, they kind of look like grains of rice, or some people say they look like baby teeth. They form not on
That's
a
not
cob.
creepy at all.
Not at all. They don't form on a cob. They form almost like a grain of wheat or a head of wheat, stacked on each other. But they have silks like a corn does. It's the ancestor of all corn. And then the next evolution was popcorn. So you can find some popcorns that actually are kind of pointy at the end, and those are closer looking to this teosinte.
And you use the kernels for that, like
the kernel of corn would be the seed. So each individual kernel of corn is the seed. So if you looked at a cob of popcorn, or during the Thanksgiving holidays, you can find them in the grocery stores, ornamental corn, the little itty bitty ones that have all kinds of multicolors or deep dark red. Those are usually popcorns, especially the small ones. So if you took them and put them in the microwave, they will pop.
They would pop.
They will pop. So and then there's flint corn, which is close to popcorn. So popcorn has a really hard shell, and that's why it pops, is the insides of it that are starchy. The molecules start vibrating around, and the outer shell is so hard that it keeps them contained until it cracks. Oh. And then once it cracks, it's like a vacuum, and it all like spills its guts.
Wow.
So because it's so superheated inside of there.
Then you add butter and salt.
Yes,
and
but that's why popcorn pops, is because the outer shell is so hard that it keeps everything contained until it has like a meltdown, basically.
Yeah.
And so flint corn it also is pretty hard, but it's got a thinner layer. So if you start superheating that, it'll burn a hole through it faster than in a popcorn, so it won't really pop.
Okay.
Sometimes it will kind of pop, but it'll be like not a big fluffy. It doesn't get that vacuum effect that causes popcorn to be popcorn. So that's usually ground into a cornmeal, or like a polenta. Grits is kind of it's a more gritty type of cornmeal. And then you have dent corn, which is what's most commonly used for cornmeal. And flour corn is also commonly used. Now, dent corn is called dent corn because when you look at it on the cob, it has little dents in it, and the kernels are usually very, very flat and stacked on each other. So if you pulled one kernel out, it would be really flat. Whereas some flour corns are more puffy looking, so they look a little bit different than dent corns. but they're both very starchy and commonly used for cornmeal. Dent corn is often used for cattle feed, and that's a lot of what is grown in the United States. A lot of the GMO corn is dent corn, or commonly called field corn, because it's grown in fields. It's used in the field. It feeds cows and
cows and pigs and chickens
and gas tanks.
So one of the next questions I wanted to throw at you is like, how could humanity benefit from universally learning how to cultivate and plant? Like your everyday person, like that didn't have any interest.
Well, I would say humanity wouldn't be humanity without our cultivation of plants.
Yeah, well, look at a lot of people today who wouldn't even know how.
Well, right. It's more of a cultural disconnection that we've gotten, particularly in the United States and in other places. But yeah, I mean, without cultivation of plants, our cultures, our humanity wouldn't be what they are.
What about that guy in Los Angeles that was like growing edible plants on like bankways and stuff like that? Yeah. He was on Joe Rogan, actually.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure who you're talking about, but I know a few people who have done things like that.
He was basically teaching people to do that.
Yeah, it's a natural instinct that we have, and it's something that I think, given the opportunity, we gravitate to, just in our own human curiosity.
So it's in our genetics.
I wouldn't doubt that at all. I mean, it's in our. It's definitely in our genetics. It's part of our human evolution, I believe, and the reason for our success as a species. But it's also evident in the plant world because we have a symbiosis. There are plants that only are as successful as they are because of our interaction with them.
Okay. And corn in particular.
Corn is a great example, and vice versa. We are only as dense of a population or healthy of a population as we are because of those plants.
Right.
Cannabis is actually another one of those.
I was waiting until that.
Well, it's an interesting thing because it learned certain characteristics that would help it spread around the world.
Oh, yeah. And we helped that along.
Oh yeah. Well, it made itself appealing to us.
Oh, yeah.
And we spread that seed everywhere.
We were like, whoa, we like this.
Yeah. But
it
corn is another great example. Like it started as teosinte, as this really hard seed that didn't look like much, but was enough. And we turned it into fuel for our cars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, ethanol, right?
We've turned it into corn syrup and all these other things. And it's sustained many, many people throughout history. So it's a very powerful plant.
And without humans kind of like taking, I don't want to use the phrase, taking hold of that technology, we wouldn't be where we were at.
Right.
Like we wouldn't have the availability of the societies that we have now because of food.
Exactly.
Think you can think about like all this like artificially made food and beef and all that, but without cultivated plants, we wouldn't be getting.
Well, you wouldn't be able to have the beef without cultivated plants.
Exactly.
They wouldn't. There's not enough.
What would you say is, like, other than corn, the most important cultivated plant that humans have ever?
That's a really tough one.
Isn't it though? Isn't it? Wheat?
Well, wheat's up there. Yeah. I mean, I would actually argue that cannabis is probably one of them. More for its versatility as a fiber. Fiber and food than its medicinal qualities or psychoactive qualities, which are also important. But I think that would definitely be in the top 5.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I couldn't argue that.
Definitely, it'd be in the top 5. Wheat, I would say, is probably up there too. Soy,
rice,
and beans. Well, I mean,
beans.
soy is a bean.
Yeah.
So bean is kind of a really broad category. It's legumes.
A legume.
So soy is technically a bean. Peas are technically a bean. So that's another one. It's really protein dense food and has a lot of different uses and versatility. Um, yeah, that's a really tough question. when I'm trying to think globally and not just
Well, it's just
regionally.
kind of. If I would have thought about it beforehand, I would have like.
Yeah, that's a deep rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
And it depends on if you're talking about just importance food wise or importance, like I said, with cannabis being a really important fiber.
It's a tough question.
Because like ropes wouldn't have been strong enough to cross oceans without hemp.
Yeah, dude. Yeah.
I mean,
true.
that's ships were their sails and ropes were all hemp to cross great distances.
That's a good point. Like without hemp, we wouldn't have had like the materials, the strong enough. Material.
Yeah, that's the thing. Or materials that lasted long enough that weathered as well.
Yeah.
Things like that. So yeah, that's a pretty important one if we're looking at like the usefulness of a single plant to the human existence and experience.
Nice.
Yeah.
So the next thing I would really like to get into is like just survival in the Sonoran Desert when it comes to edible food, finding water, staying out of the sun, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a important thing to keep in mind and a pretty deep topic, but
Yeah. It's a deep cut.
it's a deep one. So the desert, any desert really can be really dangerous if you're unfamiliar with it. Some deserts get really, really cold at night, and some deserts are really hot during the day.
Is it wrong to say the Sonoran Desert's kind of unique as far as
It's very unique, yes, both in its plant life and just
topography?
yeah, it's a very unique place. Closest places are actually in Afghanistan and Pakistan that are very similar types of deserts, but we have unique plants here that they don't have, and vice versa. But there's a lot of plants that'll help you survive, and observing the plants and the animals that live in the desert give you a lot of kind of clues as to how to survive yourself. So I was talking about earlier how bees and things like that will find little arroyos or dry creek beds because there's still moisture in the soil that they can suck out. Even if it's not a flowing creek or river, they can kind of push some sand aside and get down to a little bit of moisture. And animals in the heat of day will bed down in the shade of a tree that's 3 feet tall.
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
It's so that you do what you got to do to survive.
When you have to be smart about not moving around in the sun.
Right. When it's middle of summer and middle of the day and it's 110, 115 degrees, you don't want to exert yourself. The more you move around, the more you perspire to keep your body cool, and then you lose water, and then you need to replace that water, and there's not a lot of water in the desert. So best idea is to not move around a lot in the middle of the day and move around more at night during the hot season.
Yeah.
That's just what most of the animals do here to
You
get by.
You have to take a cue from the animals.
Well, exactly. I mean, they're the ones that.
Well, you and I have both
exist.
lived here. You and I have both lived here all of our life.
Mhm.
And you go outside in 115 degree weather. It's like, say you're like out camping or something.
Mhm.
There's nothing out
Yeah.
at 3:00 in the afternoon.
Yeah,
You
it's almost dead quiet. You know,
Yeah.
if you're out in the wild desert, there's cicadas, little insects that are very loud sometimes, and every now and then you'll see a bird flutter from one bit of shade to another bit of shade. But most things are hiding out.
Mm-hmm.
Reptiles are actually a little more active.
Yep.
Because
the
they
good old
take
Gila monster.
Gila monsters, snakes, all those things, rattlesnakes. But in general, most things are hiding in the shade during the peak heat of summer, during the middle of the day. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Wintertime, it's not as big of a concern. It's not hot. I mean, but still some areas are very exposed to the sun. So that's something to keep in mind, even though the heat exhaustion's not in effect.
I would say water is the biggest.
Water is a big thing. So it doesn't rain very often. There's not a lot of springs. You know.
You have to take your water from the surroundings. You have to, like,
Yeah, or carry water with you. You know.
yeah. Like I saw one trick years ago, and you remember Dual Survival?
Mhm.
No, it was actually I'm wrong. It was on Survivor Man. He did the Sonoran Desert, and he managed to find a plastic bread bag
Mhm.
and put it around a bunch of leaves of a mesquite tree. And
Yeah, you can. So again, thinking back to plants, they perspire. They to keep themselves cool. They release water through their leaves, just like how we sweat. And if you put a plastic bag around that, you can collect that perspiration, that water that's coming off the leaves to keep them cool. Now it's going to basically cook those leaves.
yeah.
Um, and you can do the same thing with cactus.
But you might-
the cactus that are full of that mucilage, the prickly pear opuntias, they're full of water. But if you ate it, it also has some mild acid. You could eat a little bit and it would be fine, and you would actually benefit from the moisture. But if you ate a whole bunch, you're probably going to be sick to your stomach unless it's cooked. There's some oxalic acids and stuff like that that'll kind of irritate your stomach if you eat too much raw cactus. So the idea of getting water out of a cactus, a lot of people have heard that. It's only specific cactus are mild enough to be able to do that. So like aloe vera is one.
Yeah.
And again, that one's from Africa. It's not really native here. But you can eat an aloe vera and it's not going to irritate you. It's actually somewhat soothing to the digestive tract. So there are a few that you can do that.
Aloe vera just seems to be overall beneficial. It seems.
Yeah, well, there's different aloes. So there are some aloes that are more caustic, I guess. But aloe vera is a specific type with a yellow flower, not the ones with the pink flowers.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Because the pink ones are a little bit more caustic if you take them internally, I think.
So what would be, aside from water, what would be a big food source in the Sonoran Desert?
Well, so the prickly pear cactus, the cholla cactus, the mesquite tree. There's some oak trees that are in
Not white oaks, right? Am I wrong?
They're not really a white oak. It is.
I
I'm
totally
drawing
threw you off.
Yeah,
Your track.
you did. It's a Quercus virginiana, I think, southern live oak. There's a few oaks in the Sonoran Desert, but in the foothills, you find a lot of those. They drop acorns, so that's another great food source. I mentioned mesquite already. Ironwood beans, Palo Verde beans. These are all kind of protein-dense foods.
They grow wild.
Yeah, they grow wild without anybody cultivating them, but they're seasonal, so they're only available during maybe a month out of the year.
Mm-hmm.
So you either have to gather enough to store long term, or just use them when they're in season. So yeah, the leguminous trees like Palo Verde, ironwood, mesquite, those are easy to keep long term.
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier. You can make flour from mesquite beans, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But then there's also other things like the cholla buds, the prickly pear pads, the prickly pear fruit, barrel cactus fruit, the seeds inside of the barrel cactus fruit.
Well, in this area, in the Sonoran Desert, Sonoran Desert, it's been inhabited for thousands of years.
Yeah,
The,
it's
the indigenous people a long time figured out how to make this place work, and it's rough. Like right now, if I was to go walk outside without any resources, I'd probably perspire. I wouldn't have the skills.
right.
I wouldn't have the skills. Like if I was just like even in our surrounding desert, I would.
Well, the thing is the environment still supports life if you know where to look. So most people, in our modern society, we have a lot of conveniences, and we don't know where to look to get our food if we had to glean it from the landscape.
I like that phrase. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if we had to not rely on cultivated things and glean it from whatever the animals were gleaning it from, right?
So that would be a big thing, is to watch the wildlife, right?
That's a big clue as to things that are edible or not edible, but it's not foolproof because there's things that animals can eat and will make you sick.
Like drinking lake water.
Exactly.
We can't do that.
I mean, so it's not a foolproof thing, but it's a good indicator with certain things. I've actually, found with mushrooms, finding wild mushrooms.
Well, we haven't hit that yet.
Yeah. Well, with mushrooms, the ones that have little squirrel bites taken out of them are typically the edible ones.
Wow.
Because the squirrel doesn't sample a toxic mushroom more than once.
Maybe he does, though. Maybe he does.
Maybe he does.
So in the Sonoran Desert, when it comes to mushroom, what is maybe the most I'm trying to think of the right phrase here, the most abundant of indigenous species?
Because the desert itself,
we're unique to have Mount Lemon.
Well, right, so that's considered a sky island in the Sonoran Desert. In the desert floor, the most common would probably be desert shaggy mane.
Desert shaggy mane?
Yeah.
And now, is that edible?
Yes.
To the human.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not brave enough to eat it yet, so I can't say that it is 100%. But from what I've read, that one is an edible. I just haven't sampled it yet, so
have
I can't
you found
tell
any?
I mean, I've seen them, but every time I come across them, they're a little bit past their prime. They're kind of dried out,
right.
and so they're not very good for eating.
So, forgive me for interrupting, but I want to clarify what a mushroom is. It's the
fruiting body of a fungal organism.
Yeah, and you've taught me a lot of this stuff. It's the mushroom is actually not the organism itself.
Yes, the organism is mycelium or mycelia.
They're older than a lot of species on Earth, right?
Well, yes, they predate. They predate animals, definitely. I want to say they probably on land predate plants.
It's pretty amazing.
I firmly believe that fungi created the situation for which plants could become terra firma, that they could take root. They gave the essential nutrients for plants to make a move from water to land.
Okay.
Because there are fungi that will actually dissolve rock over hundreds of years very slowly with their enzymes and create nutrients that the plants would eventually need to get up and out of the water.
That's pretty amazing. I never thought about that. That's pretty
amazing. I think I'm a firm, and I'm still studying this. I'm not a mycologist by trade. It's just a recent obsession.
I think you know more than a layman.
Definitely. I would say it's absolutely an obsession lately, but I firmly believe that fungi are the terraformers that allowed life to make move on land and made land hospitable to what we recognize as life, with both plants and animals. But we've split as living organisms. We've split from fungi more recently than we've split from plants, meaning that
that's pretty amazing.
Fungi have more in common with the animal kingdom than they do with the plant kingdom.
Well, it's fair to say that they are a animal.
No, they're not an animal.
Okay.
They're their own thing. They're a fungi, but they are closer related to the animal kingdom than they are to the plant kingdom.
Okay, that's kind of an interesting idea, because it's like you said, they're their own. We have the plant and animal kingdom.
They're almost sentient in some ways.
I was waiting for you to get into this. Yes.
Yeah, I mean they have an intelligence, and it's not necessarily. I mean, intelligence is a hard word.
Is it a colony intelligence? Like it's
kind of. Yeah, it's similar to a colony intelligence. It's not what we would think of traditionally as what's classifies as intelligence, but it's
It can
it's
it
like
can-
a supercomputer is a better analogy. So we don't think of a supercomputer as being intelligence in and of itself. It's only intelligence because of what's behind it, the intelligence that created it. So that branch is kind of a hard thing for me to say that it has an intelligence, but it's very much like a supercomputer. It's constantly sending out tendrils of information, but miscellaneously or simultaneously receiving information back from each of those tendrils. And so each tendril that goes out might be receiving 3 bits of information back and expanding, so on and so forth.
Definitely, guys, if you have no idea of the way a mushroom expands, look that shit up on YouTube.
Yeah, just like look up mycelial mat or mycelium. The largest organism. Let me rephrase that. The largest living organism on the planet is a mycelial mat of the honey mushroom, the Amalaria mushroom, in a forest in northern Oregon.
I know what you're talking about. You showed me this.
Yeah, it's I think it's now about 3 miles or so, and it's the same organism. It's the same DNA. They've taken samples from this mushroom on one end of this meadow to the other end of this meadow, and it's the same animal, the same organism. It's many millions and millions and millions of actual mushrooms, because remember, the mushroom is only the fruiting body. So if we're using an analysis of a tomato plant, each mushroom is like a tomato on the tomato plant.
On the
mycelium is the tomato plant.
That's fucking insane.
So it's and here's the crazy thing, is it's 1 cell wall thick. So somehow, think of how many layers your skin has when you start to think of cell walls. Think how many layers your skin has, yet this thing that is 1 cell wall thick is the largest living organism on the planet.
And the way it expanded.
And it's because of its cellular intelligence.
That's
yeah.
you guys are going to hear me whispering a lot in this episode because I'm just like, what? What?
Yeah, the honey mushroom's a pretty cool thing, and it's also an edible mushroom. But again, going back to mushrooms being kind of a terraformer, here's what this mushroom does. So if you've ever been to the redwood forest in Oregon and Washington.
You've shown me photos.
Yeah, if you've ever been there, it's a very, very dense, thick forest in places. I mean, you can't even like cut your way through if you wanted to in some areas. So it's really dense forest. And a lot of it's old growth forest, very old, giant trees. Well, this mushroom is a saprophytic mushroom. So it basically...
What is saprophytic?
It basically moves in and kills the tree.
Wow.
Right? And then it breaks down the components of the tree into soil. So these mushrooms will go in, basically toxify the tree, kill the tree. And
so it attacks the tree.
Yes, and from the roots. And then the tree falls to the ground. And then this takes years, possibly even decades, for a tree to become sick enough to fall, especially if it's, a 500-year-old tree. It might take 7 years for it to become sick enough to like succumb and fall down.
Wow.
But eventually it'll get sick and it'll fall. And then the mushroom breaks down the wood, creates moisture, and this is happening to dozens of trees in the same, kind of spread. So dozens of trees in an area that had a big canopy and was thick and shaded, all of a sudden now there's light coming through because these giant trees have fallen down. And now there's new soil because the mushrooms are breaking down the wood into nutrients that are rich in sugars. And because there's new light, animals can move through there now. And so they bring other spores of fungi and other seeds of plants on their fur. And it creates these, when we're talking about 2 miles square, 3 miles square, you're talking about a whole new ecosystem that's been created by this mushroom.
That's amazing.
Within this dense forest. So
that's fucking amazing.
That's an example of the power of just one species of fungi to change an environment. And you might say it's good or you might say it's bad. If you're looking at like save the redwoods and these trees are 500 years old and it's a tragedy that they're falling. Yeah, that's one aspect of it, but that's how nature happens.
There's still a wonder of nature.
Well, and that's within nature's courses, and so, but it's creating a whole new ecosystem with the fall of these trees. It's creating all these different complex sugars and stuff to happen in the soil, which is a perfect recipe for new life and different things to happen. Different birds moving into that area because there's light. Different insects that exist there. Those insects draw in other animals, and it becomes a whole new ecosystem within that ecosystem. And that's kind of just like
fucking amazing.
Yeah, that's a little sliver of the power of mushrooms.
It's a little sliver of the power. So before we end, we have to talk, since we got into mushrooms, we have to talk a little bit about the psilocybin.
Yeah.
So, what do you know about the psilocybin? Because I don't know shit.
Well, there's some
how does it affect your brain, and why does?
Well, I don't, I can't say that I'm an expert on the actual effects of psilocybin in the brain. There's some really interesting studies being done that I've learned about, as far as different impacts that it has on.
I put you on the spot.
Well, different impacts that it has on the brain, and some very positive effects in relation to dealing with trauma or PTSD.
Oh, you're right.
Another really interesting thing is something I read about it being stacked with other mushrooms. Very low doses of psilocybin. I mean, we're not talking really. Like a trip level of psilocybin, very low doses,
microdosing,
combined with lion's mane mushroom, which is a Heraceium species of mushroom, and niacin, and that has been used in some studies on cognitive function with people that have dementia and Alzheimer's. As well as
is cordyceps part of that?
That's a different thing.
Okay.
That's a different thing. This one is specifically lion's mane stacked with a small amount of psilocybin and niacin. And the reason why they use niacin is they figured out that niacin. So if you've ever taken too much niacin, a very common effect is that your skin feels itchy. And you kind of get flush. You get kind of red and itchy.
They use that with heart disorders.
Yeah. So if you're taking a niacin supplement, a lot of times you get real red and itchy, and so it's your nerve endings flaring up. And so so this is the interesting thing of stacking these mushrooms. They're stacking this niacin with the lion's mane and with psilocybin, both of those things showing neurogenesis effects, neurotropic effects, meaning they facilitate synapses in your brain and things like that. So stacking it with niacin drives those compounds to your nerve endings and basically acts as like a catalyst to get them to the axons of your nerve endings and in your synapses in your brain. And so there's been some really interesting studies being done recently for the potential of psilocybin really repairing brain health, fighting depression, creating new neural pathways for people to deal
PTSD and shit
with
like
PTSD and trauma. But also there's some really interesting things to be said for the kind of calming effects, or I don't even know how to describe the sensation of what it would be, but for people that are terminally ill, kind of coming to terms with the fact that they're not going to be around for another year or two, and really kind of coming to peace with that and really just having moments of joy despite the fact of their inevitable demise. There's some really positive things that I've seen.
I
in
have
studies.
too. Now that you mention that,
Yeah,
I have
so that's what I have to say about psilocybin. There's also something that Terence McKenna wrote many years ago called the stoned ape theory.
I was gonna bring that up.
Yeah, so anybody that's interested, I would encourage you to research that. It kind of cites the possibility that
The reason that we are humans.
well, yeah, that the psilocybin or other psychoactive mushrooms that occur in high nitrogen environments or manure, cow patties, things like that, go back to our early times of humanity leaving the savannas or moving into the savannas from the trees,
experimenting with new
being
food.
hunting and gathering people's. Ingesting these mushrooms over thousands and thousands of years, possibly developing our brains in the way that they have to be kind of higher thinking animals. I think that's an interesting
I do too.
an interesting topic in theory, but it's a really, really deep one. So.
Yeah. Well, let's bring this to a close, brother. Thank you for doing this with me. It was a really cool episode. Rufus the Villain's never done like an episode like this before. Like it was science.
For science.
It was for science. So thank you again, Chad.
No problem.
Thank you again, all you listeners out there. And that's Rufus the Villain. And I'm out.